Well, good afternoon and welcome to our book review time again. I know many of you must be wondering why they was concentrating on the Second World War and so forth. Well, we find it a fascinating period, but if you've got any ideas, let us know. Now, I want to pick up two books today in the short time that I have allocated me, and I want to start in this book here, The Medical Casebook of Adolf Hitler. A very interesting book, came out in the 1970s, haven't seen too many copies around, but it's really the story of a gentleman called Dr. Theo Morell, who was Hitler's doctor, or as we would call it, GP. There's the gentleman there. Theo Morell was, some said he was a quack, but it looks like he was a registered doctor, licensed to practice in Germany. Had quite a lucrative practice in Berlin in the 30s. And one of the things that he specialises in was people on diets, people who wanted to go on diets and so forth. But unfortunately, most of his clients were Jewish, and for obvious reasons, once Hitler came in, he seemed to have lost those people. Many fled the country, of course, went to America and so forth. But there's the man, Theo Morell. Interesting picture of him on the back, the back there. And I shouldn't laugh really, but this is the dietitian who, as I say, helped many people to sort of get their diet forward and so forth. Not sure he did anything about himself. But apparently just before the end of the war, he fled, handed himself to the Americans. He was quite obese by then. We'll come back to him in a minute. But the story really is Theodor Morell, who became Hitler's doctor. Hitler seems to have suffered from many, many ailments, and this book sort of highlights them in quite, not graphic details, but it lays down what Hitler was suffering from, what seems to be in the family and so forth. I mean, for example, it'll say that his first illness and all this sort of thing, upset stomach, so forth. And you can see here he kept diaries, and you can see here that abdominal pains begin 1933, just before he became Chancellor. Vocal cord, a polyp removed. Morell becomes physician now in 1936. And it seems then after that, all the highs and lows that the Nazis are going through, especially Hitler at the top, he needed someone to sort of take him up and bring him down, as they call it in the old Hollywood days, sleepers. Valley of the Dolls and so forth. So you can see here a medical chronology of his patient, and then eventually came the 40s. I think he then, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, was Dr. Morell's only patient. And you can see here 1945 ruptured eardrums from the assassination attempt, bruises, abrasions, minor burns. He treated them all of these things, but he seems to have been able to specialise in what we would call alternative medicine nowadays. You see many of these shops in most towns. They're normally run by Chinese and this sort of thing then, and Morell sort of seems to have been into this sort of being able to treat his patients, not so much with registered drugs, although he certainly had these, but a cocktail of different mixtures which he could give to Hitler. Now, one of the things that's always been mentioned was, did Hitler suffer from syphilis? It's long been argued that whilst he was a student in Vienna, an art student, that he apparently visited a prostitute and contracted syphilis. No truth in it whatsoever. It's one of those stories that go around. If he did suffer from syphilis, nothing seems to have been shown later there. And Himmler, who was the Hitler's head of the police, has since suggested central nervous system was syphilis, but syphilis is protein in its manifestation, a notorious imitator of other diseases. Hitler did have negative tests for syphilis, so he was tested for syphilis, found it was negative at all. I think he perhaps was a person who was very much caught up in what he was doing and didn't really have the sexual urge, if that's the word that's needed, to sort of do something. He always said he was married to the German people and all those German women adored him and everything. But I'll just go briefly to the end here, because at the end of the war, Theodor Morell handed all his documents over to the American Medical Association, and you can see here, if you're a doctor, you study medicine and anything, you can see what he was being given, his red cell group, his white cell group, and so forth. Even got copies here of an electrocardiogram. So you can see all this here. There we are, Professor Morell, and there's another one there. And so it goes on. End of the war came. Hitler dismissed Morell. Morell fled, not to the Russians, had no intention of going to the Russians. The Russians took all his documents with him and fled into the waiting arms of the Americans. And they were quite shocked by this man who turned up very obese, very nervous about what might happen to him and so forth. He seems to be one of the early doctors who experimented with penicillin. It was just coming in then, and he seems to have saw the virtues of using penicillin, whereas many doctors at the time were saying that it wouldn't work. Certainly after the war, penicillin was the drug then. But I just want to go back to this book very, very quickly, because the foreword is by one of the Nazi war criminals who was at Nuremberg, I should say, and that was Albert Speer. Now Speer, as you know, we've talked about him before, he was Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, and he was sentenced to 25 years at Nuremberg. He really should have been hung by a rope, because he did authorise slave labour, and only after the war when all of this came out. But he does make quite an interesting observation here, which I've picked up on here. I just want to read it to you and tell you why I think it's interesting. It's on page 12. He says here, he talks about Hitler. Now he was unrestrained and reckless. He would lose his temper, flush deeply, and in a rapid, loud voice, breaking with excitement, denounce the incompetence and mendacious cowardice of the general staff. Nothing wrong with that. After such an outburst, Hitler would have to pace the room furiously for a long time, wordlessly snapping his fingers until his agitation somewhat subsided. Then again he would go back to the table to sit hunched. Truly he came from a different world. And I want to pick up that different world there, because he says here, he goes on to talk about Hitler. He says that wherever Hitler went, mass exultation was called forth. People would rush to see him. People had to see him, they had to get near the Führer to touch him and spoke. When he spoke at public meetings, he could be certain to find a hypnotic atmosphere of unconditional submissives. It was really there when he arrived and rose to a high pitch at the beginning of his speeches. I was able to observe the way Hitler, after a series of strenuous was revived by this kind of stimulant. Probably what Morel would given him. But to me, this sounds like the Antichrist when he comes, because he will have such a following wherever he goes. Crowds will turn out to see this man. They'll follow his every move. And if you look at these war films of Hitler in the 30s and certainly the early 40s, wherever he goes, the crowd are flocking to see this man. Interesting book. If you're studying medicine, it's all on the back there, all the drugs and everything there, all about him, the symptoms and so forth. Syphilis, doubt it. I doubt whether an art student would have had money to go to Prostitutes in Vienna then. Dr. Morel, sadly Dr. Morel died in 1948, 3 years after escaping from the bunker. Went into deep depression himself, obviously couldn't treat himself. Very interested that he was a doctor who treated people who had diets. Interesting book. So there's a book, if you see it, certainly worth picking up, The Medical Casebook of Adolf Hitler. All of these men are driven by something, and sometimes it's not always the medicine, the doctors that is given to them.